Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind-Gut Conversation. Today I have a really special guest. It's a real treat. Nipun Mehta, whom I met at a conference of the European Mind Life Institute in outside of Munich a year and a half ago. And we had a very special dinner after the formal symposium. And ever since, I've been trying to track down Nipun for this interview. And for the most unusual person that I have talked to in these interviews, as you'll see in the next 30 minutes or so. So Nipun, in his mid-20s, quit an exciting and well-paying job in the tech industry to become, believe it or not, a full-time volunteer. And over the last 15 years, his work has reached millions, attracted more than 500,000 volunteers, and mushroomed into numerous projects like Daily Good, Awaken Circles, and Karma Kitchen. And we'll probably talk a little bit about this one of these projects later. Nipun is also the founder of ServiceSpace.org, an incubator of projects that support a gift culture and economy. Among his many prestigious accolades, President Obama appointed him on a council for social change, and the Dalai Lama recognized him as an unsung hero of compassion. He has addressed thousands of gatherings around the world, given multiple TED Talks, speaking next to wide-ranging leaders from Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak to author Elizabeth Gilbert to civil rights legend John Lewis. Another very unique feature of this story is that one of Nipun's most formative experiences was a walking pilgrimage across India with his wife of 6 months, whose profound lessons also became the subject of his widely read address at UPenn commencement. Nipun's statement in life reads, "Bring smiles in the world and stillness in my heart." It sounds like a very simple statement, but Nipun is one of those people that has put this into reality and continues to prove that something like this is possible in our world. So welcome to the show, Nipun.
Thank you, Emeran. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm happy to be here. And I still remember the time we met at our in a restaurant. Well, I guess we met at a conference, but we really had this wonderful dinner together where we got to know each other. And it just felt so improbable in so many ways. So it's a delight to have gotten to know you and your work. Thank you.
Yeah, so this dinner and meeting you was a good example of something that fits really into your worldview. These so-called coincidences, or better said, synchronicities that happen, that are sort of a feature of widely distributed networks, where you don't expect. So nobody's planning it. Nobody has a preconceived idea of any of these meetings coming about, but then they happen seemingly spontaneously, and they take on a deeper meaning. So clearly, this was clearly an example for me of one of those synchronicities.
Yeah, absolutely. And doesn't life happen like that? You happen to be staying back after this conference. I was also there. We're both looking for dinner. And it's like this small village outside of Munich. And here we go in this Bavarian restaurant. We were ordering vegetarian food. It was just all so perfect.
Yeah,
but I think that's the beauty, is that when you are open to life's intelligence and you trust that, even if it goes beyond the intelligence of your ego, and you trust in that emergence, I think life is a lot more exciting. I think life is a lot more engaging, and I think a lot more happens through you because you're tuned into a more data like that. So.
Yeah. So maybe we'll start the conversation with this topic. So you've sort of laid out in very clear ways this change in our concepts of systems of organizations, from a centralized hierarchical top-down organization to decentralization, and then ultimately to a distributed network of actors in a system. And you laid this out really well in one of your TED Talks. Maybe if you want to say a few words about this. I'm interested in networks coming from a totally different angle. So I'm interested in networks initially from a biological standpoint, because clearly in science we have undergone this revolutionary transition from looking at simple causality from point A to point B. Single intervention does one thing, but then in reality, it doesn't really happen like that. And so science is in the process of a major paradigm shift towards this network science, to look at everything in terms of networks. So maybe if you want to say a few things about these traditional concepts of planning, execution, efficiency, prediction, to these properties of these distributed networks.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a fascinating topic, because I think it's not just biological. You see this network effect, this non-linear causality that you're talking about in the biological world. You see it in the social world, and I think you see it in the spiritual world as well. So there's a really interesting through line across all of that, which when it starts integrating, I think it becomes even more powerful. But for me, I can tell you my introduction to it. So I was a big fan of Gandhi. Still am. I grew up in India, and ever since you're a kid, he did remarkable things purely with the power of love and nonviolence. And so but in his time, he had no choice but to use this broadcast model, which is one to many. And in India, post Gandhi, his successor was somebody who actually used, he didn't do one to many, he did one to one. He walked village to village and inspired, among other things, inspired rich landowners to donate land to the landless. And it was a remarkable movement. And I think now we are in this era where we will have to do like a many to many response to the challenges that we face. So you go from one to many, which is the TV broadcast model, to one, which is a telephone network model. And then you get into the internet era, which is really many to many. And when you're in a many to many area, when you really see that in a networked ecosystem, causality is not so linear. And when it's not linear, what kind of leadership do you need to hold that, right? How do I need to address let's say my personal health, when you have so many elements in your body that are engaging? How do I lead that whole ecosystem? How do we do that socially? And how do we do that even spiritually? And I think all of those are very interesting questions. And I think they're kind of new questions, because we never quite understood the depth of that. I mean, sages have been talking about this forever, but we never understood the depth of that until this internet era hit, and until this, massive information revolution took hold. So now we just have a lot more data, and we say, wait a second, it's not quite how we thought it was. And that then starts to beg the question of, well, who do we need to be able to be leaders? So if it's not plan and execute, and it's not, plan and execute is very old school, B school kind of approach, where you say, here's my plan, this is how I'm going to execute. What does it mean to search and amplify? Right? In a network where stuff is already happening, you go looking for patterns of positive deviance and you amplify them. But now the premium goes from, I have a vision and you will all follow my vision, which takes a lot of coercion and a lot of shortcuts that you are invariably going to have to take. From that to the premium now being on the eyes, right? On what you are seeing. It's not just what you want to project into the future. it's how you're holding the present. It's like how you're tuning into the little things. That's very different than a traditional leader who's tuned into the bigger things. So that's just one example of many ways in which I think leadership needs to change if we assume an interconnected whole that is operating all together.
So, I mean, this, I mean, it sounds fascinating to me, particularly seeing how this is unfolding on so many levels of society, and I clearly, see so this as a paradigm shift of our culture. That it's not going to be easy and fast, because it's like turning around an aircraft carrier in the ocean. So it will, but then again, systems sometimes have very spontaneous and unexpected behaviors. So it may happen faster than we think. But are there any practical examples that you could just mention where this has actually happened in the, so maybe you want to say a couple of words about this project Karma Kitchen, which is hard to believe, really, that something like this can work on that scale. But I think that's a good illustration that what you talk about is not just theoretical or
Oh, yeah. So yeah, I mean, even at a, so you can go at a theoretical level, and I'll get to Karma Kitchen, but I think at a theoretical level, everyone knows why Tesla is worth way more than all the different car companies that come before, because it's a network company, right? Like we all know the Facebooks of the world, which is a many-to-many network. But what you have seen and what we have seen collectively is many-to-many networks on in the realm of profit and also in the realm of protest, but we haven't yet seen it in the realm of love. And the reason why love is significant is because it aligns as we said, the biological, the social, and the spiritual. And when you have that alignment, what is significantly different is the quality of the bonds. So Facebook can tell you that, or any social network, or any many-to-many platform, there are thousands of many platforms. I mean, everything on the internet that's successful ends up being a platform. But on that platform, if it's used for commercial purposes, if it's used for, things that are divisive and polarizing, you don't have this deep alignment. And when you don't have the deep alignment, the quality of the bonds is not that strong. So the tensile strength of these bonds in a network, it's not just the number of ties, it's the depth of the ties. And that is something that is ignited with love. And so then the question becomes, how do you manifest this, right? How do you create a many-to-many network around love, right? And what are the different examples of it? So in ServiceSpace, we've been doing this for 20 years. We started by building websites for nonprofits, and we were using purely intrinsic motivations of volunteers. So it was all volunteer run, which meant that you can only do it out of love, right? If it's, there's no other thing you're getting in return except the satisfaction of being in service. So we started by building websites for nonprofits, and we started creating a whole bunch of portals that were verticals. And this is like, over the span of the internet, everything starts changing after a while. And so we were also adapting to it. And then at some point, people were going online too much, and they said, oh, we need offline stuff. And we started doing all these offline experiments. We created this game of kindness where people would do a small act of kindness, and you leave a smile card behind. And the smile card says, you don't know who did that act of kindness for you, but this is a reminder to, pay it forward, to keep the chain going. Which is powerful. And again, it creates this incredible many-to-many field, because you have many people doing many acts of kindness for many others. And and then they're coming online to share these stories, which is incredibly powerful. Along those lines, then we continued to build, and we said, how do you build this culture of generosity? Because that's the key ingredient if you want high quality bonds, if you want high deep relationships, if you want that tensile strength in your network, you have to be ignited by these intrinsic motivators, and particularly this deeper motivator of compassion. Really, it goes even beyond generosity. Generosity is a start. Intrinsic motivation is a start, but it like on the depth of it, it's really compassion. And so we said, let's try these experiments. And so one of those experiments was Karma Kitchen, where you walk into a restaurant and you get your meal just like any other place. But at the end of the meal, your check reads zero. And it's zero because someone before you paid for you, and you are trusted to then pay forward for people after you. And most people think that, human beings are selfish, right? Like they're not going to pay forward. Like, why would you, and that's precisely what majority of our systems are designed with, that assumption that people are fundamentally selfish. But we know from neuroscience as well that people are actually wired, and especially in the last 10 years, so much data on how people are actually wired to care, and they're wired to be connected and related. And so how do we create opportunities for people to tap into that? And so we did this, and it was, we started this in Berkeley, and it was a pop-up restaurant. So we'd run it once a week, and then in some places, so it was in like 23 places around the world at one point. And it was very popular, and UC Berkeley ended up doing this remarkable research on it. And the title of that research paper, which is widely cited now, by the way, and the title of that paper was "Paying More When Paying for Others." That it's not going to work in every situation. It's not going to work at a car dealership, or it's not going to work at, for every scenario that you can dream of, but it is going to work for many things. And as a society, we have to really create that spectrum for a healthy society, for a resilient society. You cannot just leave everything to transactions, which is direct reciprocity, where Karma Kitchen was indirect reciprocity, that I give to you, you pay for someone else, and that someone else pays for someone else. And then ultimately what goes around comes around, because we're all bound up in this web of humanity. So I like, to me, the service-based whole entire service-based ecosystem is built with these ideals and with this fundamental notion that we have to build this field of generosity to create a whole new realm of possibilities. Because without that field, all your projects are going to have a very low ceiling, because they're going to be transactional in nature. So how do we move away from that transactional mindset into something deeper, and deeply then align the power of many-to-many networks at the biological, social, and the spiritual?
So, I mean, in many ways, it seems like you have to reverse these deeply ingrained concepts that have, been cherished and pursued in the West, both in science and philosophy, and definitely in business. And these are concepts, that business schools are based on. In science, a concept like the selfish gene.
Yeah.
Is something that is still a very popular concept. How do you think? And then I mean, there's other belief systems in the world, always have been, mainly in the East. So India and China, traditional Chinese philosophy, Buddhist philosophy. So there has been this other part of the world, of the planet, that has in some ways always pursued this other path. So do you think what we're going to see in the West? I mean, we've essentially come to a point that we're dealing with an unprecedented number of crises that seem to be all converging and somehow interconnected with each other. Maybe on top, being the climate change, which will become the most dangerous of these, but also like the whole the social inequality and income inequality. So do you think this is we're at a point where there's a possibility for really a revolutionary, radical change of our basic assumptions that this is going to be necessary to prevent and deal with some of these crises. I mean, they're not going to be manageable with our old ideas and concepts, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
I agree. I mean, I think we're facing unprecedented crises. I think, and we are so polarized, and all our technologies are further polarizing us, and that is hard to relate. And when it's hard to relate, I just read a headline today saying that I forget where, but some schools were opening up because the suicide rate was just skyrocketing amongst kids. We need each other, to survive. And um, when that connection is in short supply, we're going to have all kinds of different problems. And the rate at which we're going, the rate at which, even our response to climate change, like everyone doesn't suffer equally. And so when you have that deep discrepancy in how people are going to be affected by these catastrophes, or by policies, or by countries, or by wealth. There's so many different ways that we can other, and all of these things are going to start to, I think they already are creating lots of suffering for lots of people. Now, I think there are two ways that you can go. I don't know which way humanity will take, but I'm trying in one direction. I think in the face of suffering, this is where I get inspired by the Buddha's teachings, because the Buddha, and I'm not a Buddhist per se, but I like what he says, and he says his first noble truth is, I'm not an expert in it, but like there are these four basic noble truths that he talks about. And first one is there is suffering. But how we respond to the suffering, I think, determines which direction we go in. Like we can respond to suffering and contract in fear, in isolation, and start accumulating and start othering people, or we can respond to suffering with compassion, with this opening, with this kind of liberation, and say, hey, my old worldview didn't quite work out for me. That's led me to the suffering. Let me abandon that. And in that openness, let me see how I can embrace more love. And so I think you'll have both of these responses, but which one will be the one that steers the larger course of humanity? It'll depend on you and I, and it'll also depend on the solutions we create that support this kind of behavior. Right. So if you don't have like spaces, I mean, we talked about Karma Kitchen. I'm just using that as an example. But if we don't have these gyms, with these kindness gyms, right? Kindness is like a muscle too. The more you are kind, the more, the stronger your kindness muscle becomes. And so that's really the question: is that will we create these kinds of spaces which allow for these human virtues to flourish? And if not, then I think we run the risk of compounding our suffering, compounding our isolation and separation and disconnection and polarization. And this is what, all the solutions that we create, we have to be extremely mindful about the foundation which creates that solution. And right now, especially in the pandemic, people are creating these solutions, and it feels like you've accelerated technology growth. Not feels like, there's actually data on this, by like 10 years. And but if we do that without thinking about the deeper ramifications, we may just speed things up. Like I just saw the other day, I live in California, and they said, from now on, during the pandemic, they, at the toll booths, they decided to no longer have attendance, just so it was contactless. And then now that they can have attendance, they're like, actually, we're just going to keep that. And so it's like complete attendant free toll booths, which means you can't pay toll for the car behind you. Like it's impossible. And I mean, it was already illegal to pay parking meter coins for somebody else, but now it's like you can't even pay toll. And that sounds like a silly, small example, but people who are designing these things aren't thinking about the social costs, and not just the social cost of like people seeing each other face to face, but people actually meeting in a very deep way. right? And we saw this repeatedly in spaces like Karma Kitchen, where you see that because you are coming for a meal and that meal is gifted to you, and because my meal is gifted to me, the invisible bond between us is very present, and it affects the behavior of the whole. So this is where the sum of the parts, and this is also network science, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so how do these parts need to be connected? If hydrogen and oxygen come together, and neither one of them is a liquid, but if they come together in a particular way, you create a whole new possibility, which is water, right? So how do we start to do that? And if you arrange the carbon atoms in a certain way, it turns into graphite. So what is that certain configuration that allows for this kind of a flourishing, and what are these spaces and systems that encourage that? I think these are the questions that we have to hold if we are going to move from suffering towards greater connection.
So you mentioned earlier that, which I totally agree with, that this pandemic has really accelerated the evolution of these interconnected systems of communication. And I don't know what we would do if we didn't have these systems right now.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be able to work from home. We wouldn't be able to talk to our friends and, family. And so there's on the one side clearly this evolution, this rapid exponential evolution of these technological systems that connect people. But do you think that the other side, like these principles of of compassion, generosity, love, will they be emergent properties of this increased interconnectedness, or do you think that this will take an outside force to really make that change or make these systems, behave in that way?
I think it will take an outside force, or as in, I think the current forces that are determining innovation are biased towards transaction, because they're all they're all motivated by money or driven by money, and money is a substitute for relationships. And so it facilitates transactions. Now, transactions are good for certain things, but they're not good for everything, right? Like if my relationship to my mom and dad is transactional, and they're like, look, I changed your diaper so many times, like you owe this to me, that doesn't sound right at any level. And I think that's essentially what we're doing with technology. And so this whole field, which is driven by really the private sector. I mean, even there used to be a public sector and a voluntary sector, but all of those are dominated by the private sector. And when money is the primary driver, what you have is a bias towards very short-term thinking, right? It needs to be immediate and an extreme phenomenon. And it's no surprise that such a world creates like, an iPhone that has an app that has infinite scroll, that we just keep on scrolling for a cheap dopamine hit 200 or 2,600 times a day, on average. So like if we create that, and you can sing praises of this, but I think what you lose is the nuance. Mm-hmm. What you lose is the subtlety. What you lose is the depth of connections and the quality of relationships. So I think that's the open question, like who will create that? I don't think it's going to be the private sector. I don't think it's going to be the public sector, because public sector doesn't even understand like all the threats of AI and all the different challenges. So I don't think it's going to come from there. So then the question is, where is it going to come from? And we really just have the third option, which is the voluntary sector, right? And so for me, I've put all my chips on the table for the voluntary sector, and said that, look, if nature has truly wired you to be kind, I'm going to extend an invitation and say, let's just be kind for no agenda. You get no reward for it. It's completely opposite to the financial world. To motivate somebody to come and work at your startup, right? Like you would usually say, oh, I'll give you this, you have this is in the future. Here, there's like none of that. And you would say, well, would that work? Like, why would anybody be motivated? And that's the hypothesis that you test. That if you're truly wired to be kind and you create a meaningful service opportunity, then that will be regenerative. And if that's regenerative, then that will build on itself. And if it builds on itself, then what happens next? There will be some emergent properties and some nonlinear ripples. And this is, for me, this has been the greatest lesson and the greatest proof in my life, for me personally, about, for 20 years of doing this, that you see that people all over the world are just moved by love. They respond to love. They respond to generosity with greater generosity. And I'm not saying in every case, under every scenario, right? It's not like this naive poetic notion. In a very practical way, if you start to look at the arc of an ecosystem that is motivated by intrinsic motivators, it invariably, you start to see that this longing for compassion, this longing for aligning with that natural impulse to be related and to serve, is far stronger than this impulse to be self-centered and securing your own benefit through separation and polarization. So I have faith in it, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I don't anticipate this happening from the traditional forces. I mean, well, maybe. I mean, hopefully, if it happens, I would be the happiest person. But I think that's the core question we need to hold, no matter where we are, whichever sector we're in. How do we ignite a response of compassion in presence of today's trying times?
Yeah, I mean, also, coming back to an area that I'm familiar with in neuroscience, this difference between happiness and eudaimonia, these two different ways of feeling good, which now we know have profound effects on the health of the people that practice these different types. So striving for happiness with increasing, buying things, and generally does not have a beneficial effect, a lasting beneficial effect on your mind and on your immune system. But eudaimonia, doing something for a higher purpose and a meaningful, interaction that can be like all these other qualities that we talked about, like, compassion, and that they actually have a measurable biological effect. I think the more people that are realizing this, that even skeptics or policymakers, I mean, there's a lot of work to do, I think, in terms of educating the leaders, both, the young business leaders and the, because you essentially have to you have to start from scratch. I mean, imagine if, I mean, you left the high-tech industry. I mean, imagine there would be 50 or 100 other people like yourself that that don't leave these industries, but that lead these industries and have the same mindset. I mean, that I think that's what it would take really to turn things around. And I don't think, since you are a shining example that that's possible, why wouldn't it happen, with more individuals in the future that are inspired by your talks, by your TED Talks, and by your practice? So another example for that, again, that I've kind of followed with great interest, this whole thing of the change of our dietary preferences, that a lot of young people and millennials and younger sort of embrace, a largely plant-based diet for various reasons. Obviously, I mean, it's something that you do out of compassion for the planet in some ways, because, if you continue our current dietary habits, it has detrimental effects on climate change. And the fact that this movement has been increasing, is not just in the US, but also in the most unlikely places like Argentina and Brazil, who are essentially quintessential for their meat cultures. I think that's a good example that the most unlikely things can happen.
I tend to be very optimistic as well. I mean, I think I think this is how we're wired by nature. So I think this is where nature is going to take us. Now, the only question is, how much are we going to resist before we go there? You know, so I think it's inevitable that we go in this direction. The question is really just about when. Over the last 20 years that we've been doing this, I would say, you know, we've gone through various phases. We as in larger we of a culture, I would say, but particularly in the Silicon Valley, you know, you went through the dot-com era and you went through all these, you know, we had this great economic, you know, situation around 2008, and all sorts of things have manifested in the last 20 years. Has it been net positive, net negative? It's hard to say. And I actually don't motivate myself. I'm not motivated by visible change, by immediate change. And that's in keeping with the nonlinear emergence that we were talking about. Because if you truly believe in nonlinear emergence, why should it manifest in the 100 years that you're around? You know, why does it need to manifest in like the 20 years that you've been doing one particular element, one particular piece of this? Maybe it manifests in a nonlinear way in, you know, 3 generations from now. So to me, even this idea of validating our work, validating our worth, validating even our values in a short-term way is part of that same trap. So I don't even ask that question for me. It's not a relevant question. I find meaning in service through every act. Like I do a small act and nature rewards me. Like it's like eating 2,000 chocolate bars, right? Isn't that what they say? You would know more about this, but it's you know, all the different reward mechanisms inside me kick in. And even beyond that, it feels, you know, you just feel a lot emptier. And so your fullness is ironically and paradoxically coming not because there's a bigger I, but there's actually a lesser I. Not because you're able to see a visible change that you created, but because you are part of this infinite continuum that allows for, you know, either the resurgence or just the spark of these values. So to me, I'm incredibly optimistic. I think there is no way but for humanity to go, not just humanity, I would say all life, to move towards compassion. I think that's the only real direction. There are question marks about how many detours we take. And the less detours we take, the less suffering there is. And so I'm all in favor of that. But I think the larger arc is invariably going there. And I won't be around in this form to see that. And I don't need to be. That doesn't motivate me. What motivates me is the small action in front of me. And it's very regenerative. The more I do it, the more I want to do it, you know. So it's incredibly powerful that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable, you know, to listen to you. I could listen to you for hours. I mean, what do you think has made you such a unique individual that sort of defies, you know, the main dominant values of the society that you live in, particularly the Silicon Valley, you know, the hotbed of entrepreneurial people that, you know, supposed to become billionaires when they're 25 years or 30 years old. Has it been your upbringing, or what do you think is been the main factor in your life that sort of triggered this trajectory or influenced this trajectory?
You know, I think if you would have asked me earlier, I would have said earlier, as in maybe like 15 years ago, I would have said that it's because I saw clearly that, you know, because I was around this train of greed. And it was a train that everybody was on. And I just saw that it was it was on a collision course. And so I got off. It became clear to me that my happiness was not going to come from acquiring more things and having more, and whether it was more money or more power or more, you know, whatever, even wisdom, that more thing was not my cup of tea. So I would have said that it was seeing the stark contrast between the dominant paradigm and the voice in my heart. And I used to even also say that there's very specific points where that momentum sort of shifted, you know. And I would say for me, particularly when I was 17 years old, there were very clear shifts that happened in my view, in my life, and things of that sort. So that's what I would say, is that I experimented, and like a good scientist, I kind of saw that this didn't work and then this worked, and I did that. But now I don't think it wouldn't quite be as simplistic, maybe, because there are so many things that we want to do, that we are convinced of doing, uh, doesn't necessarily mean we will do it. And so there was a kid that came up and asked me, he says, you know, what advice would you give your 16-year-old self? And I said, I think when I was 16, I would have thought that, you know, 90% of my life was my effort, was because of my doing. And 10% was sort of unexplained, nonlinear effects, you know, that we might say in network science. And I would say now that that equation has flipped for me, that I would say 10% is effort, and 90%. Because if I trace all this back, you know, it's like, yeah, of course, my parents' upbringing had an effect on me. Of course, the fact that I was raised in India had an effect on me. Of course, the fact that I immigrated in the US when I was in middle school, very hard years to immigrate, you know, had an effect on me. And so I can go down the list, and you say, how much effect did what have? And I realized that it's just grace, right? It's just like, I don't know. You know, like 90% of life, that whatever happens to me, I think 90% of it, I tend to now see as grace. But there is a momentum to that grace. There is a movement to that grace, and that is towards greater harmony of your hands, of your heart, and your of your head, hands, and heart, right? And so that harmonizing, I think, is what that grace is moving all of us towards, if we allow it to. And so I think I just allow it a lot more now. So you know, that's not really a great answer to your question of, hey, how did you become how you were? And my answer is, I don't know. I used to know. I used to have answers, but now I just have questions. But I'm very comfortable with that idea of, like, I don't know, and I don't really need to know.
Mhm. Um, you know, we've come almost to the end of this, so probably some people, quite a few people that are listening to this interview are not yet on that same wavelength. You know, what advice would you give people that are not on this wavelength to explore at least, or give it a try to understand it, and to you know, embody it, and get into a similar way of thinking? What would be like the baby steps to do that?
I would say go out and do small acts of service. And that sounds so simple, but it's so profound in multiple ways, because when you do small acts of service, you suspend the reciprocity element. You're not thinking, oh, what's the impact of this thing, right? You're actually realizing that, wait a second, I'm doing it for the joy of doing it. And as you tune in to what's going on inside you, you see how regenerative it is. You see how meaningful and fulfilling it is, that your reward mechanism isn't coming from the outcomes, it's actually coming from the process. And that rewires your whole approach to things. You're not using people as a means to an end. You're not using your circumstances as a means to an end, because there is no end. It's like a mirage. You get there and there's something else you're chasing. So it sounds like, you know, it sounds deceptively simple, but to do that small act and to see that, yes, there is an external ripple effect, and that, of course, is meaningful, but there's also an internal ripple effect, that it changes the eyes through which you look at the world. So there's this one guy from Texas, this businessman came up to me one time, and he's like, you know, he came from a long ways away. He wanted to have a chat, and he says, "I want to leave a legacy behind. What do you recommend?" And he was a very successful businessman. And I said, pay toll for the car behind you, you know, back when you could. This was many years ago. And he's like, okay, yeah, Nipun, that sounds good. You know, I like kindness. And I said, well, what do you really think? You know, and I said, no, really, I think you should pay toll for the car behind you. And he's like, I came all the way for this, you know. And of course, we talked a little strategy, and we talked a little bit of culture and different, you know, acupuncture points in our systems and all of that. But at its core, I was saying that when you pay toll for the car behind you, you will change your eyes through which you look at the world. And once you change your eyes, you will start to see not just the immediate possible, but the adjacent possible. Right? Adjacent possible is like you may see, oh, there's just one door. What's the big deal? You know, but once you open that one door, three other doors open up, and three other doors show up, and then you start to open those doors up, and you know all kinds of new possibilities start to emerge. And so you won't know to take those avenues until you actually engage in that small act. So for me, it would be a small act, and I would try to do a small act that tries to build bridges, because our world has so much polarity right now. So build a bridge with somebody who, you know, maybe you wouldn't connect with otherwise, maybe who's in a different demographic. Maybe if you want to be courageous, do it with someone that you have altering views with, you know, but like build a bridge, and go have those conversations, engage, listen, learn, be humble, and see what emerges in the space. As Rumi would say, you know, there is no wrongdoing and right doing. Or rather, he said, there's a field beyond wrongdoing and right doing. I will meet you there. And that's a great place to meet not just other people, but even yourself.
Yeah, let's stop. A wonderful advice, simple enough for anybody listening to this to get started. And yeah, I'd like to thank you again, Nipun. This was a wonderful, inspiring conversation, and I hope we'll be able to continue this over the years, and you know, interact in the same fashion that we've been discussing the you know, this network, this emerging network of gratitude, compassion, uh, and giftedness. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Emeran. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.